And you and I
tremendous
have
gap in
very, very
understanding
different
here.
ethical frameworks.
No, but what you don't know what your ethical framework is because you don't understand what I'm saying.
You would say, I'm pro-slavery.
Oh, yeah, I do think you're that, yes. But I have to get there. We have to build
I mean,
the ladder.
you are a slippery rascal, aren't you?
0% of you are subscribed. Fix that.
Hello?
Hello, how are you?
Hey! I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good. I am a professional economist. I was so at least for a couple of decades until I became a police officer in my second career. And I'm very happy to be with you.
Oh, well, happy to have you here as well. Thank you.
I believe that the government spends far too much energy regulating our relationships with each other and needs to get the hell out.
Well, that's my concern. I actually strongly disagree. I think the state has a responsibility to the best of its ability, there are no perfect systems, protect people from corporations. I think that corporations have an incredibly autocratic role in the lives.
Do you think that we ought to have regulations protecting corporations from each other or corporations from unions?
In some instances, sure. A legal framework should dictate essentially all relations between legal bodies, yeah. I don't know what exactly they need protection from.
The government should regulate
unions,
all relations among legal bodies.
Yeah, like corporations, unions. You have to
I'm
file
sure
these.
That's a fairly chilling statement.
Well, I don't think so. We have laws, and these laws already exist. You have to file for a union, right? Like these organizations, you have to write.
No, I'm not arguing that they shouldn't have a right to exist. I'm just saying that the idea that the government ought to be regulating all relationships among legal entities, like between you and me, between corporations, between us and corporations, between corporations and unions. I think that is a frightening, breathtaking statement, to be honest.
True.
I didn't know you were going to go there. That takes my breath away.
Well,
that actually makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
Well, that's the thing. What I said may take your breath away, but legal frameworks are what keeps me from physically taking your breath away. You know, if I were to meet you in the street and we were to get into a fight, like legal frameworks.
I think there's a big difference between a criminal code and regulating the relationship between two individuals in terms of an employer-employee relationship.
Well, wait, no, what? Fundamentally, this is just a legal framework that we use to guide people's behavior towards mutually beneficial outcomes. We have these guiding behaviors.
Do you feel like it's the government's role to guide our relationships?
If it would keep people from murdering each other in the street, then certainly, yeah. That is guiding people's behavior. That is the state using its power, its autonomy, its monopolization over violence.
Is that how you feel about employer-employee relationships, that we're guiding people to avoid murder?
No, I think that we're not doing nearly enough to guide people away from murder, to be honest with you. I think that at the current relationship,
look, you and I agree that we should be
violent.
Guiding people away from murder. I spent 11.5 years of my life trying to protect people's individual.
Yeah, you were a cop. You were an enforcer of the state's role in guiding people's behavior with each other. It's just a matter of which laws we do or don't agree with. We know for a fact, because we have millennia of historical evidence to support this case, that if corporations want to set up a system where they pay you jack and you just have to live with it, that's life. It is only through a greater power.
I'm sorry, where is there an example of that?
Literally all of human history, from feudalism downward, and through the first several centuries of capitalism.
That strikes me as similar to going to the argument about murder. I mean, why don't we focus on this century in this country?
This century,
is there really
you mean the 21st?
Where you think that people feel so trapped that they need the government?
So we can ignore like historical precedent if you want, and I would just defer to undocumented immigrants. People who are not protected by the state because they're not citizens immediately get exploited by corporations here, because it turns out when you don't have the legal protections afforded to you by U.S. citizenship, and the first time you interact with a cop will be your last time in the U.S., that means it's actually really easy to exploit you. That's happening right now to millions of people in this country because they can't rely on the state to protect them the way it protects you and I. They are not given the same fair consideration from corporations. They're treated worse.
Well, the exploitation of immigrants is a little bit deeper problem than that. The black market's created by the government precluding people from coming in legally and therefore incentivizing them to come in through human trafficking is a much richer problem than just people coming in and getting low-wage work.
I agree. I'm pro-open borders, but you have to acknowledge that without the protection of the government, those undocumented laborers are immediately exploited. We could get a comparable effect simply by removing government.
It's not because that they don't have a minimum wage in place.
but they're not getting paid minimum wage in a lot of cases. So that often is actually the issue.
The market won't drive their supply of labor to a price that exceeds what you believe that the state minimum wage ought to be, or in some places already is. That is
They're paid
not
less than minimum wage. There are There are undocumented immigrants and U.S. citizens working side by side on farms in the Southwest, and the U.S. citizens are getting
paid
more.
less than the minimum wage. Now, what would happen if you instituted a minimum wage and made it stick in those places?
In a way that protects the undocumented workers? Well, then they would get paid minimum
wage.
In a way
that you call it protection, but it's not protection. Assuming those markets are clearing, and there's no reason to believe that those markets don't clear like any other market, what you're going to end up with is fewer people being hired.
Well,
that's not protecting them.
There's just no evidence to suggest that. Also, the number of workers we have working.
That's how markets work.
Well, it's how you think markets work.
There's no reason to believe that they don't.
It's not how markets work. We need the number of workers we have because that's how we produce our food. The idea that if we had to pay undocumented workers minimum wage, that we would just suddenly cut like to a third our agricultural production because instead
you made
we just
up
wouldn't
those
pay
numbers.
The tens of millions.
You're going back to the murder example. Yes,
I'm not going to the murder example.
I don't think it's really fair to say, well, we need government regulation, otherwise we would murder each other.
You have not answered the question that I have posed to you, the hypothetical here. You say the government does not protect us from corporations, that it's not necessary to manage or regulate these wage interactions. But we have a group of people who are not protected by U.S. law, not functionally at least, undocumented immigrants, and as a consequence, they're horribly exploited for their labor. That would be you, and that would be me, if we lived in a state that didn't afford us any worker protections. We would be just as hungry and desperate as the millions of Americans who lived at the turn of the century.
I can't speak to your resume. You graduated from Humboldt, and you seem like a very educated guy with good skills.
Thank you.
I'm fairly confident that you would be able to get a job paying over minimum wage if the government failed to protect you in some sense. I think that that's a silly thing there.
Could I enjoy that wage knowing millions of my countrymen were living in row houses starving because they didn't happen to be born into an affluent family like I was? I would be the same person then, arguing.
Do you really think
that's
how labor markets work?
Well, historically, yes, most people have been poor, so that is an empirical fact with regards to the labor markets. Do you disagree with the assertion that around the turn of the century, like 1900 or so, that most Americans were poor?
Most Americans were poor. The reason that they were lifted out of poverty is because markets were allowed to work. The reason that wages were so low at the turn of the... I'm sorry, you find that funny?
I do, but I was going to let you finish.
That's the historical record. I don't think that's a very contentious statement. That's just how economies have developed. And by the way, not just the United States.
In the 1900s,
the reason wages were so low at the turn of the century is because there was such a great deal of labor available in the agrarian economy that was migrating slowly to the urban economy. There was so much labor available that there was no way to drive up wages except in the very, very long run.
And yet the robber barons who controlled the factories those millions of poor people happened to work at for 12 or 14 hours a day were very well. It was
because they were providing the jobs that drew. Look, I'm not arguing with you about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but you can't just sit there and mischaracterize the way labor markets.
I haven't mischaracterized anything. That is what a market does when there are no protections for workers. The biggest, meanest, fattest bastard who already owns the factories gets all the money and everyone else gets jack. This is the economics of cuckoldry. As we've seen throughout all of history, regardless of whether or not there was an oversaturation of labor in these areas, in the absence of legal protections, employers will treat people as badly as they are capable. They will enslave you if they can, and if they can't enslave you, they will sharecrop you, and if they can't sharecrop you, they will pay you the lowest amount that you can legally be paid. And this has been the trend through American history up to this point, where people in every state are paid the lowest amount corporations can get away with, and they will pay you less without these regulations. See, this is what I mean about freedom. You talk a big game about freedom, but the only freedom you care about is the freedom for pigs to munch more money off the workers doing the actual work. Out there on those farms...
You're now lecturing me on what it is I care about?
Yes, I am. I think you are concerned primarily, and this is why you were a libertarian and a cop, because the freedom you care about is the freedom cops protect, that of the bourgeoisie. You care about the systems and rules that protect property.
The city I worked for didn't have a lot of that. Can you spell it for me?
The institution of the police is one which predominantly protects property rights. You care about property rights. Property is something that I do not have in equal measure to, say, Jeff Bezos. What I have in equal measure to him is a life. All of us have lives in equal measure. Laws should protect life. But when you care primarily about protecting property, all of a sudden your considerations are skewed heavily towards those who have more of it. And that's what I'm hearing right now.
I don't know who gave you the impression that I or anybody else who's a libertarian is somehow consumed with this idea of property being what matters. So I hope that we can dispense with that. I'm not going to say anything that insults you or your motivations or anything, and I think that I deserve the same respect.
Are you telling me that as a libertarian, you are not concerned with the protection of property as a fundamental legal value?
You seem to believe that libertarians are consumed with property as opposed to people's protection from crime and violence. You seem to want to characterize police officers as being consumed with this idea of protecting rich people's property. I don't know where you got that. You obviously didn't get that from working as a police officer. Maybe you know police officers who have that attitude. I'm sorry for them or for you and being led astray in that sense. But no, that was not my job, and that was not my attitude, and that was not what my employer asked me to do.
Well, if we're not primarily concerned with the protection of property, then maybe we should talk about the greatest road to freedom, which is, of course, wealth redistribution. Much as in the case when the land and the property...
You're characterizing taking money
owners
from someone and giving it to someone else as promoting, what was the word you used?
Freedom? Yes.
I don't think freedom is an appropriate word to use when it comes to taking money from someone and giving it to someone else. By whose authority would you do such a thing? Because you thought it was a good idea or because you voted on it?
That's where all the authority for my ideas comes from. Yeah, if I think it's a good idea, if I think it's ethical, then I'll argue for it. The institution that actually carries it out just has to be the one capable of getting the
Well, that's the difference
done.
Between you and a libertarian, is that I might think something is a good idea, but I'm not shoving it down anyone else's throat.
Oh, well, see, I think that traditionally, if a person is, subscribed to an ethical position, it's usually good to bring about the conditions which allow that condition to flourish. I mean, we want good things, right?
Those are two different things. You are a slippery rascal, aren't you?
If you think, for example, that slavery is wrong.
Creating the conditions for something to flourish is very different from shoving it down their throat.
Okay, well,
you seem to think that it's a good idea to take money from someone and give it to someone else.
How about shoving abolitionism down somebody's throat, right? The Civil War, North versus South, Those Southerners, they were getting awfully uppity down there with their slavery and with their Fort Sumter attacks. I say, if you think ethically that slavery is wrong, which I do and you do as well, I think it's okay to shove that down their throats. I mean, Vernon Sherman went and marched his way on down south, and I tell you, we took a lot of money and property from those folks.
I don't think you're going to get too much pushback from me or anybody else in the United States about that.
Oh, sure. I would hope I wouldn't, at least.
Exactly.
So, but in that case, I mean, we did indeed shove abolitionism down their throats, right? We killed a lot of Confederates to prove that point.
Yeah, I don't think that bringing up slavery is a particularly useful example in bolstering your case that we ought to be taking money from rich people at force of government coercion,
but we
and giving it to someone else because you think it's a good idea. I don't think those two things have much in common.
Well, to them,
do you really think that slavery is similar to the argument against slavery is similar to the argument in favor of taking money from people and giving it to someone else?
We call workers wage slaves for a reason. But yeah, the Confederates thought slaves were property. To them, the Union was taking their property. That was the issue. Do I think they're property? No. But I think you and I have different definitions.
So you would agree with me that the two arguments actually have nothing to do with each other.
Okay. But you agree then that it's morally justifiable to shove abolitionism down the throat of the Confederates, right? That's a fine thing.
It is ethically justifiable for a community, whether a community small, state, or federal, it is legally justifiable, morally, ethically justifiable for a community of people to get together and decide what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, about protecting people's individual rights. Absolutely.
Well,
so do I think that that ought to be something that's constitutionally protected by the federal government? Yes, absolutely. I think we're all disappointed that the Constitution didn't ban slavery.
Well, it depends on the rights we're talking about, certainly. So the right to not be a slave, what about indentured servitude? What about people selling decades of their life for travel over to the United States? Because that was one of the big ways that the Irish came over, for example. They wanted to come over here where there were jobs and less famine, so they would say, okay, take me over there in a ship.
Some
if I
gray
survive 6
form
years
of
to you.
I get where you're going. Some gray form of slavery. No, I don't think that slavery is tolerable, whether it's slightly gray or heavily gray. All of that should be intolerable to us. I'm just waiting for you to somehow connect the dots from this discussion, on which no one would disagree. Connect the dots over to, and therefore we have the right to use our government to take money from people because we think they have too much of it, and give it to someone else because we think they don't have enough of it. So I want to hear those dots get connected.
So the dots are not only connected, we're at the same dot right now. Because indentured servitude, if there were indentured servants in the United States and we said, no more, this is now illegal and we are freeing these indentured slaves, all right? Well, what are we actually doing? What we're actually doing is breaking a contract made between that indentured servant and the person who bought their time. What do workers do when they go to their workplace at 8 a.m. in the morning? They're selling their time. On a shorter time scale, to be sure, and with less preconditions, but the link is right there. On a fundamental level,
you believe that because
we're talking about
slavery
time
is
and
bad,
money.
We have the right to get rid of, or otherwise regulate, but including get rid of, any contract between any two people?
I think that there's a good reason why the government has rules when it comes to contracts and what you can and can't sell away. For example, indentured servitude.
That's not much of an answer to what I just said.
I'm not done. Indentured servitude is illegal in the U.S. You can't sign, you could sign a contract saying that, but the government wouldn't recognize it as valid, no matter who you signed it to. Now, I think that that's a good thing, because I think that sometimes in times of desperation, people might agree to legal contracts that are exploitative. And I think it's the right of the government to prevent that exploitation. I think that
governments don't have rights. Communities of people have rights to form a government and enforce criminal statutes, legal frameworks as they see fit to advance the interests of their society. Governments don't have rights.
The prevention of the exploitative contracts that I'm talking about. Now, I think that a lot of the labor that we do today falls under that purview. I think that we have a fundamentally exploitative system. It's not as bad as slavery. I won't pretend that it is, but I'm
still waiting for the dots to get connected. You said that this was somehow going to bolster your case, that this all means that we have the right to take property away from rich people and give it to someone else because you think it's a good idea. That's the argument on the table. I'm waiting for you to bolster it.
When we banned indentured servitude, we were literally taking property away from the wealthy. The property in this case was the signed time of the indentured servants. We've done this many times. We did this with the slave owners too.
I'm sorry, I can't give that to you. I cannot say because some people labeled humans as property, that was somehow a precedent for, therefore we can take people's money if they have too much of it.
No, indentured servants just don't connect. Indentured servants weren't considered property. However,
I can see now why I'm a libertarian and you're a socialist. I didn't think the divide was as big as it is.
Yes, I agree. There's a tremendous gap in understanding
very different ethical frameworks.
No, but you don't know what your ethical framework is because you don't understand what I'm saying. Indentured servants weren't considered property. The contract of their labor and time was, because it was a guarantee. It was a contract they filed. It was no different functionally from signing a contract with any regular contractor saying that they will finish a job painting your building or whatever. It just lasted a long time.
No, I get it. You believe that because the government should have the right to abrogate certain contracts, it therefore also ought to have the right to take property from people. So I get it. I heard you.
You agree because you said the government should have the right to break indentured servitude bonds. So you agree then that there are times when the government has a right to take property from the wealthy, because that is what that contract was. Not the person, but the contract. It represented an investment of wealth, of capital, that was the property of the person who bought the indentured servant. It was a servant, after all, not a slave. They weren't property, but their labor was entitled.
I heard you. By your argument, it would also therefore follow that because I don't think the government has the right to take property away from anybody, that in some sense you would say, I'm pro-slavery.
Oh yeah, I do think you're that. Yes, but I have to get there. We have to build.
I mean,
the ladder.
you're not very serious right now. That
okay.
You think
so,
that it's a change somehow in ethical frameworks to be able to say both. On the one hand, I don't believe in slavery, and I do think there are certain contracts that communities ought to have the right to abrogate on the one hand, and on the other hand, some
contracts should be banned.
You don't have the right to take property away from people. So I don't believe it's true that for those two things to coexist, you need two different ethical frameworks.
If you are arguing that the government has the right to break contracts on an ethical ground, you are arguing for the redistribution of property.
Indentured servitude includes an element of coercion for enforcement. And that enforcement takes the form of requiring the labor itself to continue. No court would make such a claim on a person's labor in the modern American state, and correctly so. We all agree on this.
Wait, no, that's not true. If you stopped working as an indentured servant, then you could be faced with penalizing fees that would send you to debtor's prison, or if what you did was bad enough, you could be sent to like criminal jail. And the same is the case. And
that's why we don't tolerate it, because we don't tolerate coercion.
But no, this happens today. You can break a contract and ruin your life for it. This is a thing that exists right now. The element of coercion that you're describing is present.
I'm sorry, do you know someone who quit his job and went to jail for it?
I know 37 people who did, yes. But also, if you quit your job...
I think that's a more interesting topic than arguing about the definition of indentured servitude. We should have a podcast about these 37 people. What happened?
If you quit your job when you're contracted to continue labor, you can be sued for it in civil court, and your life can be ruined. If you quit your job in a way that brings about some criminal negligence, which is possible, though difficult to do, then you could be faced with criminal...
Very difficult to do. I mean, we're talking about walking out in the middle of a surgery if you're a doctor. No, it's very difficult.
Actually. Yeah, no, wait, hold on. Isn't that coercive? Why should a surgeon not be able to just walk out mid-heart transplant? Like, to do otherwise would be slavery, because the state would be coercive.
You've adopted a certain liability that... is understood. This is where torts come from. This is where civil liability.
Same as indentured servants.
You're just being silly. I think you're kidding.
No, the thing that you can't understand
you insult your intelligence.
Is that labor, the relations between laborers and the bourgeoisie, has been fundamentally the same at its core. It is only transformed in its kindness. Slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, sharecropping, the modern-day workplace, it still describes the fundamental relationship between owner and operator, between proletariat and bourgeoisie. The only question is, how many barriers are there between what we live with and the just barest skinflint human existence possible? What are the layers that protect us from going all the way back to the BC era? What keeps us from that point? And the truth to that, and the only thing that has ever protected us from that, is law. Hard, concrete law, protections, specifically protections for the weak against the powerful. Corporations are powerful. Individual citizens, regular people, are hideously weak. They're weak against corporations. They're weak against the government. We must do everything in our power to use law to empower the weak and weaken the strong. Because if we don't do that, then we're essentially just enabling feudalism all over again. There were plenty of laws back in feudal empires. You know, they had them too. And those laws existed to reinforce the material ruling power of the people who were in charge, and ours do today as well, which is precisely why people in Wall Street can steal millions and get 18 months in prison if we're lucky, whereas people like you and I, if we got caught like shoplifting from a 7-Eleven, we could get one of 3 strikes that would send us to jail forever. Like, the law still exists to protect the powerful, but you want to make it protect the powerful even more. You want to strip away protections from the working man. And that's the thing I don't get. That doesn't make people free. Nobody gets freer when they aren't guaranteed a minimum wage or working protections or OSHA. They're made less free because now their life gets constricted and the people on top get wealthier.
I worked as a cop for 11 and a half years.
Does it ever give you pause that your hypothetical market forces don't actually seem to exist in the real world? No, wait, stop, hold on, wait, please, can the fake indignation...
That's not what the word coercion means.
It's not what the word coercion means to you, because your definitions are wrapped up in a cult-like understanding of economics that has nothing to do with the real world. Mike, hold on, there's a serious issue here. Do you have a carbon monoxide detector in your house, all right?
Yes.
Okay, can you check it for me right now? Because the statements you are making are consistent with severe oxygen deprivation.
I'm pro-slavery.